Kalimera, everybody. How are we? This is Frank from Talking God's Grace. Today's topic is going to be about the end times. It's it's something that I've tried to avoid talking about, and I'll tell you why. My personal experience has been this on this topic. I became one of Jehovah's Witnesses because I believed in their end-time prophetic statements that they made to me some 30 years ago. I believed in the 1914 doctrine, and that's what hooked me into becoming one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I believed the end was coming, that the generation that saw according to them back then, 1914, the kingdom being established, that generation was about to be reach its completion, and that was in the late 80s, early 90s. And so because of that doctrine, I joined the group. It wasn't about did I believe in God. I did believe in God, although I was living my own life, but I did believe in God. I was brought up as a Greek Orthodox, and that was always something I believed in. Jesus I believed in, so it had nothing to do with anything like that. It was more specific about the end time, and when that was preached to me, I was captivated by it. I thought, how did these guys know? How could they know? How come no one knows that the kingdom was established in 1914? That World War I was the culmination of a war that happened in heaven, right? Who else could know this? Only those who had been given the truth. That the truth to these prophetic statements made by Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25. And because of that, I became convinced by their explanations and reasons and charts and numbers, etc. And so because of my own personal experience and how in time I come to realize that this isn't true, as I was waking up, I felt a little bit apprehensive about talking, or my apprehension about talking about such discussion on the end times, because I don't want to mislead anybody, with my own views on this topic. I have many other views on different things, but the only thing that I'm 100% convinced of is my assurance as a child of God and my eternal salvation, that it can't be lost. That's what I'm really sure about. Everything else I'm fluid with. And so what I want to present to you is where I'm feeling a little bit more confident now with myself and with my identity as a child of God. And so let me share some things from Matthew 24-25, an overview if you like, and then we're going to get into specifics in the coming weeks and months of the rest of this year. The concept of the end time. So I'm going to be reading from some notes, okay? So just bear with me as I read through some of this stuff. So the concept of the end times has always been a topic of interest, as you know, and apprehension throughout the history. And while the idea of apocalypse has spurred our imagination, the Bible, specifically the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25, provides insights into the end of the age. Some translations say the world. Unfortunately, some individuals have misrepresented Jesus' words and used them to make specific predictions about the end of the world. Now, Jesus warned his disciples in Matthew 24 about false prophets who would mislead many people. He urged them to be watchful and prepared for his return, emphasizing the need to be vigilant in this way. But how does that look? And how have people misinterpreted such anticipation of Jesus? It's interesting. And so this is why I want to get into it, because Jesus predicted many things. And when we think about Jesus Christ, he's not really seen in today's circles as a prophet, as someone who, back then anyway, and today I guess, as a prophet. We don't really talk about Jesus being this prophet. We usually talk about him being the Son of God. Of course, he was unique, and he was far more than just a prophet or a teacher, as the early those who thought of him in the past, rabbi, etc. But it's interesting when you go through his account. Let me find, as I said, I'm reading off some notes. This is what they said about Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 21, verse 10. Because we know he performed many miracles, and prophets performed miracles, Elijah, etc. But what about his ability to prophesy? How good was Jesus in prophesying, or how accurate, and was he trustworthy in prophetic statements? Well, notice what they said to him, or said about him, in Matthew 21, 10, 11. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet." This is Jesus, the prophet. Interesting. Maybe we have never ever thought that that's how they viewed him. But this is how the crowds saw him. And don't get me wrong, a prophet, as the Judeans recognized Jesus as a prophet of God, we might today not think too much about that, because organizations are referring to themselves as prophets in some way of God, like Jehovah's Witnesses, and individuals call themselves prophets throughout the centuries and even today, and we don't think much about it. But really, a prophet in those days, it was a gold standard. There was a gold standard for being a prophet, and that standard had to meet a certain criteria to be from God. He had to have 100% accuracy in his predictions. Deuteronomy 18:20-22 bears that out. And if it wasn't accurate, then they weren't of God or from God. And so if someone's prophecies or foretellers of events that didn't come to pass, they basically weren't speaking for God. Now, do we know any of people and organizations that have failed in their prophetic statements? Yes, the very one I spoke about earlier. And individuals. There's a guy who wrote a book called in 1988, or was it 1988? 88 Reasons Why the End Was Coming. I mean, you can look it up yourself. And there's been throughout Millers in the 1840s and others, right? I mean, they're not just the only group. And even today, individuals can't help themselves but put out predictions. But rather, let's go back to Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate prophet, and other prophets pointed to him as the ultimate prophet. So what we should then think about is, if here is referred to as the prophet, we should take heed of what he says, not only about the future, but his warnings as well. Jesus predicted many things that we sometimes miss, and we don't. And I think the important thing is, because we don't, or we're not students of history, I'm not saying everybody, but it's important to understand the time he was in, the culture he was in, because a lot of his statements were to Jews, and they have, in their culture, they would understand some of the things that Jesus said as regards to the virgins, marriage feast, other statements he was making, like one about the eagles gathering around the carcass in Matthew 24:28. Strange, but to them it's not so strange, right? Jesus talked about shortening the days and fleeing to the mountains. Mysterious to us, but those who heard and saw it fulfilled, not really. They understood that. To them it was plain. Jesus predicted in Matthew chapter 24 and other areas that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But not only did he talk about that or prophesied about that, but he gave a very detailed picture as to how that would take place. When, where, and how that destruction would unfold. It wasn't vague like a Nostradamus type of thing, right? Jesus made no less, according to one author, 40 predictions just in that one event. And all of those events, all those prophetic statements came true. He talked about the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, Matthew 24:29. What is he talking about there? Why does it matter? Then he talked about, not long after that verse, he talked about no one knows the day and hour. So we shouldn't speculate on days and hours. Yet, what happens? What are we doing? What is people doing, I should say, and not all of us, obviously. There are many people speculating, continually to speculate, throwing dates out, left, right, and center. Oh, this is the date. No, this is the date. This was the date. I mean, they just can't help themselves. Jehovah's Witnesses have their date, 1914, stamped. That just is not moving now. I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end, but do you see what I'm saying? Jesus' prophetic statements all have come true. Therefore, his warnings are just as important as the events. There are some future events in Matthew 25 that he talks about, and that's what we're waiting for. And that's what we're going to be talking about as well in coming weeks or months, whenever. Now, here's the thing. I'm not here to badmouth JWs or anyone else who is doing this. But if we, as individuals, are prepared, and including myself, I spend a lot of time studying their prophetic statements in the past. What about listening to Jesus and the apostles about us as individuals and the way we are saved and the grace gospel? You see, these doomsayers have a lot to say, but if we are listening to Jesus, then we have less time for them, because now we're focusing on what's really important. Christ in you, right? Are you saved? The Spirit in you, is that, are we yielding to the Spirit? So the question I want to ask is this: how can we protect ourselves from these distractions that you hear, these voices? It's now, this is the day, do this, do that, blah, blah, blah. 1947 with Israel, right? The temple's being established now in Jerusalem. They're getting ready to make sacrifices, etc. There's the overlapping generation for Jehovah's Witnesses. It's just around the corner, guys. So how do we protect ourselves from these distractions? Because, we've been fooled before. We've all been fooled before. And we say, but I know better now because of that. But each new prophecy, got to remember, sounds convincing. Right? It's like, whoa, there's another prophecy. Oh, they're saying that. Oh, did you see that event? Right? It's very seductive. Right? It's very seductive. But we've got to look at past history and be convinced and trust Jesus from what he says, because he's really the true prophet. Yes, he's the Son of God, but he was the ultimate prophet. Let's not be ignorant of the past that leads us to leads us to follow wrong people in their thoughts and organizations. Those error and twisting of scriptures have caused much hurt in people's lives, whereas Christ's prophecies saves us, but bad prophecies hurt people and embarrass the children of God or the church of God claiming to be Christians. We have to learn to tell the difference. Yes, there are many fulfilled prophecies in Matthew 24 and 25 and are assigned to us as well. They are proof that the Son of God sees the beginning from the end, and he is trustworthy, but more than that, they reveal that Jesus is very caring. The reality is, friends, Jesus could have said nothing about Jerusalem's dark future and his future return. He could have said nothing about any judgment coming. He could have said nothing about how one can be saved. Right? He could have said nothing. He could have just died on the cross and that would be it. But he didn't do that. Even as he bore the cross, he stopped to prophesy about the tragedy he saw coming. In Luke chapter 23, 28, 29, it says, but Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then they shall say, then in verse 30, then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills cover us. He could have said nothing, right? But he cares, and he wanted people to know what was going to happen. He wanted the believers to understand what was going to happen, and that could help them as well in their preaching work as they went about talking about Jesus, that he was the Messiah, and that there would be events following through if they took heed. Let me just find my concluding thoughts. So just going back, and this is why, as I said, this is just a bit of an overview. We need to be careful about people and their interpretations. As Jesus warned, he talked about many messiahs and false prophets popping up out of nowhere. My final thoughts on my critical reflections of the end time prophecies in Jehovah's Witness teachings is this. If you look over the history, the organizations, the presidents and the writing committees, and those that wrote articles, their cavalier representation of matters can be attributed to the fact that most Jehovah's Witnesses are unaware of the changes of and history of the doctrine, including the subtle changes in the wording of their articles. Despite prophetic failures, many witnesses remain confident in the society and governing body and are unwilling to question their words or statements. If you actually did a study on from what they started off to believe, that like for example in the beginning in 1879 I think it was, they believed that Christ's kingdom was established invisibly, that he returned, that 1914 was the end, Armageddon was then 1914. That's what they believed. Then they adjusted that teaching. They still kept 1879, by the way, as the day it was established, but their dates started to change. And then in the 1920s, late 20s, Rutherford brought up the kingdom to 1914. Okay, I mean, think about it. And then the dates of his return would be later on, and then it came different years were given. 1979 was the most prominent one, but the teaching centered around this idea that in 1914, when it was established, the kingdom of God invisibly, that generation that saw it, as I alluded to in my introduction, would see the end. And unfortunately, I was one of those guys towards the late 80s that started to believe that we were at the end. And I was, and it was interesting, the feedback I was getting from brothers and sisters back then was saying, well, you're very fortunate. You're one of the late hour workers, right? In Jesus' illustration, you're one of the late hour. How fortunate are you, man? It's just around the corner. This generation, that generation, well, they're all almost dead. That generation of 1914, those folk that saw that kingdom being established, or they didn't see it, but that's what they believed, right? It happened because of World War I, was all these signs and evidences that prove that. Well, they're about to die, and you're one of these ones that are just about to enter into the paradise earth, new earth. The nucleus of the new earth will be you and whatever, thousands of people. And I thought to myself, wow, I'm very fortunate. I am, I can't believe God has shown mercy on me, and I've been given the light to see this idea. Of course, largely what happened back then was a fizzer. The time of the end came. The generation didn't see the end. It kept going. So while specific dates, so the society has woken up, and they've avoided using specific dates, and they've got rid of that idea of the generation. However, they always the terminology they use are always about the shortness of time. It's just around the corner. It's about to happen. Look at this. Look at that. Look at these world events, etc., etc. The societies or the governing bodies' arguments regarding the time of the end have evolved over the last 30 years, especially since the generation changing. Their adjustment, because the 80 years was about up from 1914 to 1994, and guess what? In 1995 they had an adjustment in their thought about this generation, and they removed the fixed time frame for Christ's return, and subsequent explanations happened. It was an open-ended sort of a thing, that generation. But then in 2012 and 13, they introduced the overlapping generation, because we're about to hit 2014, and we're certainly 100 years in Christ's rulership as they see it. I mean, what do you say to people? You have to come up with something. So they came up with this idea of an overlapping generation. I think it was 2012-13. It could have been a bit later than that. I should have checked that. But that overlapping generation, what they're then saying is the generation that saw 1914, and then somewhere along the line another generation that knows these guys, and now there's caused another overlapping generation. It's left many people confused, and even the wording that they use, they didn't go to find, to explain generation. They didn't find any solid proof that means an overlapping generation in the New Testament. They had to go back into the Old Testament and find something that looks like overlapping, and then they use that, I think it's in the book of Numbers, they use that to justify their current teaching. It's bizarre, but it's confusing at the same time, and it's wrong, and it's childish for them to do that. So friends, rather than relying on other people, we have Jesus Christ to rely on. He is 100% right all the time. He was right with the predictions about the fall of Jerusalem. He then talks about other things, about his return. He really felt for the people. He saw the darkness that was about to engulf that time, and he gave them a warning. It wasn't for the world. He didn't tell the world to be warned about it. It was only for those local folk in Jerusalem. And we know over 1 million Jews were killed by the Romans by 70 AD. But those who heeded Jesus and fled to the mountains, like he said, survived. And if those same people obviously didn't believe false Christs and messiahs who were around at that time, and their views, and the zealots and whoever. So we have to be careful about people today. There's no difference. Trust Jesus. Jesus has got his finger on the pulse. We should heed Jesus' warning that no one knows the day and hour, nor the times and the seasons, as he mentions in Acts chapter 1. No one knows, friends. We shouldn't be speculating like this. The uncertainty surrounding of the timing of the Lord's return should inspire a hopeful expectation and a spiritual alertness. And I want to get into that because I want to get into this idea about the sheep and the goats, these 10 virgins. And we need to understand a little bit about the past to understand what he's saying. Is he saying that a believer can lose his salvation, as some may suggest? Is that what he's saying? Or is there another way to look at this? So I want to present to you the alternative ways, not the ways that conventional Christianity has told you. So guys, let's talk more about this subject. It's a very important subject. Let's not get caught up in other organizations and their speculation. Just run to the hills when you hear stuff like that. Let's focus on Christ. He is the true prophet. He's the Son of God. It is only through him that one can have life, as he said in John chapter 14:6. It is through him. He's the truth, the way, and the life. No one can go to the Father except through him. So to get life, it's only through Jesus. And because he's got a 100% track record, we should trust him with what he says and the warnings he gives in these chapters of Matthew 24 and 25. Now, keep in mind, these are to a covenant people when he's talking, not to Gentiles. He's not talking to Christians, he's talking to Jews. And so that's also important to keep in mind, because many Christians have spiritualized everything, have put double meanings on these words, and, etc., etc. But there's a way we can look at it, and then there's another way we can look at it. So we want to find out, looking at it from the correct manner, the correct way, and seeing exactly what in the light that Jesus was presenting this information. Have a great day, guys, and we'll talk again soon. See you later.